All right, Dr. Thompson, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you.
It's great to have you. It's hard to even know where to begin. A lot of your work is very technical. You're a mathematician. And a lot of the research is very technical. I guess I would begin by asking you your title, Mysteries of the Sacred Universe. What exactly are the mysteries?
Well, what happened is that I was involved in studying an ancient text which describes the universe. And at the first glance, this looks like a mythological description. It talks about the universe in terms of geography. It appears to describe what you could call the flat Earth. But what I found on looking more closely at this ancient document is that it's actually giving a very sophisticated description of the solar system and of a number of other features of which are only known in modern astronomy. So this is somewhat mysterious. I also found that the basic geographical description of cosmology, which is given in the text, is found all over the world. And this is also a bit mysterious in that it indicates that certain ideas were apparently spread all over the world long before Columbus and modern exploration.
How much earlier?
Well, the traditional date for the text, of course, is something a bit controversial. The text traditionally is dated to be about 3000 BC, and I can tell you a story about that date also.
3000
But
BC.
in terms of modern accepted scholarship, the text dates back from anything to 1,000 years ago to 2,000 years ago.
All of this is leading up to evidence, you feel, for a scientifically advanced civilization in the distant past. How distant?
Well, what basically I ran into in studying this text is what you could call a serendipitous discovery. I was looking at the description of this flat Earth, which is in the text, and I found evidence that it contains a map of the solar system.
In other words, we all know that long ago people thought the Earth was in fact flat. And you thought that's what you were looking at was a description of a flat Earth.
Right, that's what it certainly seems to be. I mean, literally it says that. We're dealing with the Earth as a disk.
Okay.
And it's flat, which is what people supposedly believed long ago, before they had the scientific knowledge that the Earth is a globe.
Only you have determined it was not that at all, but rather a description of the universe?
Yes, of the solar system. In fact, you see, one interesting thing about the solar system, the planets orbit all in just about the same plane. I'll use the word ecliptic a lot, probably. If you take the Earth as a fixed center point for reference purposes, the Sun seems to go around the Earth in a big orbit.
Right.
And the plane of that orbit is called the ecliptic. And all of the planets orbit in nearly the same plane. They orbit in planes that are tilted by maybe, let's say, 5 degrees at most from the ecliptic plane. So if you look at all the planetary orbits, basically that is flat. And it turns out that the flat Earth actually was that plane of the solar system. So to get back to your original question, what does this have to do with an ancient, a more scientifically advanced civilization? Well, the dimensions of the orbits, as indicated from the text, and I'll tell you how you arrive at this, but the basic conclusion is that these dimensions are quite accurate from the point of view of modern astronomy.
And how could they possibly have known?
Right. How could they have known that? Either it's all a coincidence, just the numbers happen to come out that way.
What are the odds? You're a mathematician.
Well, the odds are very small. We can talk more about the whole topic of coincidence in these kinds of studies, too. But just briefly, the odds I calculated about 1 in 20,000.
About 1 in 20,000 that they would match.
That things would match as closely as they did.
All right. You were the co-author of Forbidden Archaeology. Forbidden Archaeology seemed to suggest that early man was using more scientific tools or tools earlier than he should have been, that there was knowledge back then that should not have been. And there are artifacts that have been recovered from the earth that would certainly suggest there were things going on back there that should not have been in the time of early man. Is that roughly correct?
Well, yes. Forbidden Archaeology gives evidence that at least tool-making human beings, or hominids as they call them, were in existence long before the accepted time frame.
How much longer, roughly?
Well, that gives evidence going back for millions of years.
Millions of years?
Yeah.
All right. In your new book, you're looking at the possibility of a scientifically advanced civilization that would go back how far?
Well, we're talking about thousands of years. We don't have an exact figure for the date, but the basic argument goes like this. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that people really did have a more accurate knowledge of the solar system at some time in the past. Well, you can ask when. If you go back, say, to the Middle Ages, it's known that astronomical knowledge at that time was pretty crude. And, in fact, they didn't have a very good knowledge of the solar system. So it couldn't have been then. Then you have to go back further. You can take it back to the time, well, the best astronomer of antiquity that is known is Ptolemy, who lived around 200 A.D.
Mm-hmm.
So in those days, they couldn't have had the more advanced knowledge, because his knowledge wasn't so advanced. And then supposedly things get more primitive as you go back to the early Greeks and so on.
Right.
We can trace things back, let's say, to the Babylonian astronomy. You go back to around 700 B.C. or so with that, and that was pretty crude.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to go back to an earlier time in order to find a period in which the more advanced knowledge could have been known.
How much earlier? I mean, here we're already talking about long before Christ.
Yeah. Well, the indications that I found would put it back around 3000 B.C., or let's say 2500 B.C.
2,500 years before Christ came to Earth.
Right.
Doctor, but to go along with that, to go along with this advanced scientific knowledge, there would have to be, or you would imagine there would be, an advanced civilization of some sort that would benefit from all of this advanced knowledge that was there then. Wouldn't that make sense?
Well, yes, it would seem that knowledge can't exist in a vacuum. People had to have institutions both for doing the research, making measurements, and supporting the scientists, and then they would have to have institutions for teaching that knowledge and passing it down and so forth.
Precisely. So does this mean, Doctor, that it's likely that advanced civilization has come and gone and possibly come and gone in long cycles of some sort that we don't know about?
Well, the indication, as far as I can see, is that if there was a more advanced civilization, what we have now are merely fragmentary indications of it. So
right.
We really have to do a lot of research in order to pin down the evidence that it even existed. So what I've proposed in the book is that, in fact, civilization has been interrupted by dark ages. In other words,
yes.
Instead of a gradual ascent from primitive times up to more advanced developments culminating in modern civilization, which we then expect to continue going up and up and up,
mm-hmm.
Civilization has had its ups and downs over many thousands of years.
Kind of like the stock market.
Well, yeah.
Everything has its cycles, and you're saying that includes civilization. Do you have any idea what these down periods might have been? I mean, it would have to be something that would literally come along and almost knock it down to zero.
Well, there's evidence that that has happened. For example, I've proposed that around 2500 BC would be a time when this civilization we're talking about did exist. That would correspond pretty much to the Old Kingdom in Egypt, excuse me.
Egypt, okay.
Yeah, and in India, there's what was called the Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished around, let's say, 2300 BC, in that vicinity. So what happened is, we know historically the Indus Valley Civilization apparently died out, and it died out to such an extent that city life basically stopped in the area of India and Pakistan where that civilization flourished.
Huh.
So, and that civilization is famous for having very well laid out cities. Instead of just sort of higgledy-piggledy streets going every which way like you find in old medieval towns, they had cities that were laid out geometrically in a very precise way. But city life itself seems to have stopped for a period of centuries, and then maybe around 800, 700 BC or so, it began to start up again and continued up to the present time in the India-Pakistan area.
Well, but if ancient people had knowledge of the construct of the solar system, that would really indicate a rather high level of scientific knowledge.
Yes, the remarkable implication is that at least if they knew in the same way that we know today, they had to have the technology of telescopes and various scientific ideas based on how to use them and how to measure distances in the solar system.
All of this would give, I would think, religious scholars and fundamentalists a bit of a difficult time because, of course, they have their own way of looking at all this, you know, Adam and Eve and Garden of Eden and the ejection and on from there, and the whole story told in the Bible. I mean, this predates that so far that it would be a problem, wouldn't it, for religious institutions to grasp what you're saying?
Well, in one sense, I suppose some religious institutions would find it to be more or less in agreement with their views.
Oh.
I mean, even if you look at Christian fundamentalism, which, just since you mentioned that, they have the idea that before the flood there was a more advanced civilization that got wiped out. So, and I'll just mention offhand, it's sort of a coincidence, but the story of the flood comes up in talking about this date of 3000 BC, which is something we can also come to. But the real objection to this kind of idea concerning ancient civilization really comes from modern scholarship. The basic standpoint of modern scholarship is that if you go back, let's say, to the known classical period, the time of the Greeks and the Romans and
Yes.
the Babylonians and so forth, people were pretty scientifically undeveloped in those days. And then, if you go back further, they must have been even more scientifically undeveloped. So there's a tendency to argue that if there is evidence that they were more advanced, there must be something wrong with that evidence.
So it argues it's like forbidden archaeology. Then it's the scientists who would be most upset if they had to come to terms with what you believe to be true.
Yes, basically. And there are political factors involved in this, too. You know, in forbidden archaeology, we introduced the concept of the knowledge filter, which is that knowledge that disagrees with the predominant paradigm tends to get filtered out.
Right.
So we're dealing with something similar in this case. And from a political standpoint, one of the motives behind the filtering process in this case is the tension between the cultures of the East, India and so forth, and of the West. So there's a tendency, for example, from people on the side of people in India to say, well, our civilization is very glorious and it goes back a very long time. Whereas there's a tendency to say, well, this is actually just due to their national pride, and it doesn't really go back so far. In fact, it doesn't go back as far as our civilization.
Well, if we go back to the religious discussion for a moment, I think that it is widely believed that the flood was a result of angels down here messing around with earth women and God getting upset and saying, okay, flood, that's it, everybody out of the pool, whatever. That's kind of what's believed, right?
Basically.
And so that is not, I would think, necessarily what you believe occurred, or is it?
Oh, no. As for the cause of this Dark Age period that
Yes.
I mentioned,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I'm not really saying anything about what that cause was. As far as I'm aware, perhaps the most likely argument for it is climactic. Of course, a flood is a sudden climactic event.
And one could guess that the hand of God could cause a big flood or a climate change, depending on how you look at it, right?
Yeah. Climate change might be something as boring as a drought that lasted for a long time. There is evidence for that. By the way, this cessation of city life in the Indus Valley area is paralleled apparently by a similar interruption that you find in Babylon, ancient Greece, and so forth.
This is so intriguing. So, Doctor, you think it might have been a vast climate change, the biblical flood, whatever you want to call it, something that occurred that just knocked everybody back?
Well, we're not sure how a flood comes into it. We know that people in ancient times were rather preoccupied with the idea of a flood. As for climate change, you'll find many scholars have argued that, in fact, there were periods of very intense drought in which civilization just couldn't keep going because the agricultural base was lost. And
there goes no food.
No food. People had to revert to a nomadic way of life. So there's evidence for that.
Doctor, just for the fun of it, a lot of us have noticed that we seem to be going through a climate change right now, or at the beginning of one. Could another or a similar thing occur today? And if it did, would it knock modern civilization back quite a few steps, should it occur? If a vast drought or a vast flood or global warming came along, the temperatures came up, the oceans began to inundate coastal cities, that sort of thing, could it knock mankind back again?
Well, presumably it could. That's
what I thought. All right. How convincing is the evidence that supports your contention here?
Well, there's a lot of interlocking evidence. The evidence that I'm focusing on is mostly quantitative. It's a matter of numbers. For example, this map of the solar system that I was talking about, you find that this ancient text, the Bhagavata Purana is the name of it, but in any case, this ancient text describes this disk of the Earth, and it gives numbers for the dimensions of the disk.
Mm-hmm.
And in the surface of this disk, there's a series of rings, and numbers are given for the dimensions of those rings. Now, those numbers are in a certain unit of measurement, and we have some evidence as to how long that was. So given that, you know how big the rings are, and you compare those with planetary orbits, and you find that things match up. So it's a question of the numbers matching up, which indicates that, well, either they've matched up just by chance, it's just a coincidence, or somebody must have known something.
What did you say, 1 in 20,000?
Yeah. For this solar system map, I came up with an estimate about 1 in 20,000, that the match would be that good.
How? Of course, we sit here and we say, how? How could they have known all of this then? How?
Well, let's give an indication of what kind of knowledge we're talking about. Maybe I could, since we mentioned floods, I can tell the story of that, the date of the flood. I've mentioned 3000 BC.
Right.
The traditional date is February 18th, 3102 BC. And to some people, that may sound a little bit silly. You know, why February 18th? In fact, it's midnight on February 18th. Well, the tradition goes that there was an alignment of planets at that time.
Oh?
Yeah. Now, if you go to India, you'll find that there are astronomical texts which are basically traditionally used by astrologers for calculating horoscopes. They give you a way of saying, for a given date, where do the planets line up around the ecliptic in what are called the signs of the zodiac. So these texts all assume that on February 18th, 3102 BC, that the planets all lined up, just like the horses at the start of a race. Now,
is that confirmed by astronomers? In other words, you can mathematically back up, I would presume, almost forever, can you not, and move the planets in reverse with a computer until you get to 3102 BC, February 18th, right?
Right.
And, in fact, if you do that, you find that all the planets were, in fact, aligned on that date?
Well, you don't. But you find a thing that's equally interesting. What you find is they were as closely lined up on that date as they ever get.
Okay, well, that's good enough. As closely lined up as they ever get.
Yeah, well, you see, the interesting thing is the planets, at least if you run back the positions of the planets for thousands of years, like I did it for the span of time from 4000 BC up to 2000 AD, 6,000-year period,
right,
using a modern computer program for calculating the positions of the planets.
Gotcha.
And I looked at how closely the planets line up. Well, they never line up exactly during that entire time. Probably they never do exactly. But if you look at how close they lined up at that date and ask how many other dates there were in which they lined up equally closely or even more so, in that entire period, going day by day, there was only 2 other dates in which they lined up that closely.
The reason I ask about this is because we had a planetary alignment. I can't remember how long ago it was. Everybody ran down to Sedona and chanted and everything. But the reason I'm asking is because nothing really happened then, or maybe it did, and we all didn't recognize it. I have no idea. But astronomers generally will tell us that it's all silliness, that planets lining up virtually means absolutely nothing. The gravitational influences are so weak that to imagine any effect from the planets simply lining up is ludicrous. A lot of astronomers will say that. Yes. What do you think?
Well, that may be true or may not.
Or may not.
In one sense, it's not quite relevant to the question we're facing here. What we do know is that in ancient times, people attached a lot of significance to planetary alignments.
Yes.
Now, whether they were right in doing so or not is another question.
Well, if in fact they had a giant flood, 3102 before Christ, 3,102 years before Christ, February 18th, then you can imagine they would begin to attach a significance to it.
Well, perhaps that's how the traditions came up. But you see, the interesting thing is the significance of this date. As I say, if you look at a modern calculation, taking into account the planets and which were, considered to be part of this alignment, you find that that date is right on the nose to the day for one of the closest alignments of planets to occur in an entire 6,000-year period.
Huh.
And you might ask, well, okay, how did that tradition come about? Well, we know that that date was talked about as far back as 500 AD. There's a famous astronomer named Aryabhata who talked about that date, for example, and that's when he lived. So in 500 AD, what did they know about astronomy? You see, I calculated backwards using a modern computer program.
Right.
But what could they do in 500 AD? So
not that.
Not that, for sure. Well, the question is, well, how did they arrive at that date? Now, there's a standard story of how they did it. Now, interesting thing, if you go to Oxford University and around the late Middle Ages, you'll find that that very same date was given as the date for the flood.
So maybe the astronomers are correct, and there is no effect from the planets lining up. However, to the people who experienced the synchronicity of the planets lining up and the flood occurring, that could be how it all began, and that could be why we're all concerned about when the planets line up today.
Yeah, well, what the scholarly assessment of this is that what was happening, they trace all this back to Persia in a couple centuries BC or so. And they say that there were astronomers in Persia who wanted to know when the flood occurred. They were concerned about that. Mm-hmm. And they believed that the flood was caused by some alignment of planets. So the story goes that they were calculating backwards, trying to find when all the planets lined up, because that would tell them when the flood was. So the idea is that they looked at conjunctions of Jupiter and Saturn. That's where Jupiter and Saturn line up. That happens about every 20 years. Mm-hmm. And they were going back by 20-year jumps, checking the other planets to see when everything lined up.
Right.
And that's how they arrived at the date. Well, the interesting thing about that story is that if you use the parameters that we have historically for how long it takes a planet to go around once in its orbit, you do find an alignment at that date. In fact, you find an exact alignment. But how did that come about? The parameters, of course, had errors in them. That is, we're talking about the parameters that they used back around 2,000 years ago, roughly speaking.
Sure.
So those parameters had errors. So the errors just happened to point to an alignment on that date. But if you look at errors of the size that they had in those parameters, and you go back to 3000 BC or so, you're going to be off by plus or minus a couple of years. But they hit this best alignment date right to the day, which means the chance of doing that would be 1 in, a couple of times 365. It'd be very unlikely that they would hit that exact date.
It sure would.
So the indication is that the reason their parameters point to that date is not that they were taking their crude parameters and working backwards, but that they already had that date and they adjusted their parameters to fit it. And that's why they point to that date. So the whole indication is that somehow or other that date was known, and basically it means one of two things. Either, let's say, there's a historical tradition coming down from that time, which means there was a civilization to transmit that all the way from 3102 BC down to the present. And that's how people knew. Or you'd have to say they had better ways of calculating backwards, just as we do today. But either way, it's a bit of an extraordinary claim.
It certainly is. The odds get to be awfully big, don't they?
Yeah. By the way, there's a funny thing about that alignment of planets that occurs on that date. When we're talking about planets, basically we're talking about, of course, the moon. Of course, the moon is not a planet, but it's a celestial body.
Right.
One should say perhaps celestial bodies instead of planets. But and we're talking about Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto supposedly weren't known back in those days. In fact, they weren't discovered until recently. But curious thing is that Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto also are part of that alignment.
You mean this flat Earth, whatever it is, that really isn't a flat Earth description at all, you're telling me it includes those 3 planets?
Well, I'm saying that alignment does.
That alignment does.
That alignment
that would have occurred in 3102 BC.
Right, on February 18th. If you look at the positions of Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're in there too. The planets, as I say, aren't exactly lined up. They're sort of clustered.
Mm-hmm.
But Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto could theoretically be anywhere around the whole circle of the ecliptic.
So if you had to lean toward one explanation or the other, between the planets or the alignment of the planets actually was a causative agent, and the other explanation, which is that it was a grand coincidence that they were clustered and noticed by a civilization, an advanced civilization at that time, and then sort of mythologically carried forth as, look out when the planets align, which explanation would you lean toward?
Well, I would lean towards the historical explanation, namely saying that we're dealing with a tradition actually coming down from that time period.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a number of reasons for that. Basically, the way all the evidence fits together suggests to me that there's something historical. Now, one thing I mentioned in the book is this this solar system map, going back to that topic, that involves a unit of length. It's called the yojana, but it's about 8 miles, and all the distances are given in terms of that unit. The interesting thing is that this map of the orbits tells you exactly how long the yojana should be. The traditional information that I started out with said the yojana should be 8 miles, and it actually comes out exactly to about 8.5, 8.49 something miles. Well, the interesting thing is that this opened up a whole avenue of exploration, because I asked, well, is there any historical evidence for the use of a unit of that length? And it turns out there's a lot of it. In fact, and that points towards ancient Egypt, as it turns out.
Egypt, here we go again.
Yeah, here we go. Basically, this yojana unit is made up of subdivisions, and one of the smallest subdivisions, it's called a hasta in Sanskrit, but the meaning is basically the same as a cubit.
A cubit.
Yeah, you know, the cubit is like the distance from the tip of your elbow to the end of your fingers.
Yes.
Now, these, in ancient times, or just like today, these units tend to be based on human body parts. And sometimes you hear it said, well, people had a very crude way of measuring back in the old days, and they would just use a person's arm or their foot to measure things. But the actual fact is these units were always more exactly defined, but they just conveniently related to body parts, just like the foot today